A man stands at the pinnacle of his world, a titan of finance with a city at his feet. Beside him isn't his elegant, devoted wife, but his flashy, ambitious mistress. He believes he has everything power, wealth, and 2 women vying for his attention. But he's made a fatal miscalculation. He has pushed his wife into the shadows, believing she would stay there, broken and silent. Tonight, at the most exclusive charity ball of the year, he will learn that when you try to erase a woman, you don't destroy her. You simply give her the freedom to become someone you can no longer control. And her return will not be a whisper. It will be an earthquake. The argument, like most of their arguments, lately began over something trivial and ended with a quiet, soul-crushing declaration of war. It happened at Daniel, the 2 Michelin star restaurant, where the clinking of silverware was a form of applause for the patron's own success. Richard Sterling, founder of Sterling Capital, and a man whose portrait practically screamed, "Master of the Universe," didn't like the way his wife Isabella had hesitated when ordering. "Just get the tasting menu, for God's sake," he'd snapped, not looking up from the glowing screen of his phone. "Don't hold up the sommelier." Isabella's fingers tightened around the linen napkin in her lap. "I was just considering the Dover sole, Richard." "You're not considering. You're dithering," he said, swiping a thumb across the screen. "It makes you look indecisive. Weak." That was his favorite word for her these days, weak. It was a label he applied whenever she expressed an opinion, a desire or a thought that didn't perfectly align with his own. For 15 years, Isabella had been the perfect corporate wife. She was beautiful in a timeless, understated way that spoke of old money and good breeding. She ran their Upper East Side penthouse with flawless efficiency, chaired the appropriate junior committees, and never ever embarrassed him. She was, in his eyes, another one of his pristine assets, like the Patek Philippe on his wrist or the Jean-Michel Basquiat painting in their foyer. And like those assets, she was expected to be silent and appreciate in value. But lately, the gilding on her cage had begun to feel less like a luxury and more like a restraint. The real reason for his temper, however, was sitting 2 tables away, holding court with a rapt audience. Scarlett Roach, a woman as subtle as a neon sign in a library. She was a real estate developer with a portfolio of shiny, soulless glass towers and a reputation for closing deals with the same ruthless aggression she applied to her social climbing. Her dress was a shade of crimson that bordered on violent. Her laughter was loud and throaty, and her eyes were fixed on Richard with an ownership that was both a promise and a threat. She was Richard's mistress, a fact that was perhaps the worst-kept secret in their social circle. Richard finally looked up from his phone, his gaze flicking past Isabella to meet Scarlett's. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. A secret shared in public. The humiliation washed over Isabella in a cold wave. Later, in the silent, temperature-controlled interior of their Rolls-Royce Phantom, the silence stretched thin and brittle. "The Metropolitan Children's Foundation Gala is next Friday," Isabella said softly, her voice carefully neutral. "I was speaking with the coordinator. They're still hoping you'll make a keynote address." "I'll be there," Richard said, staring out at the blurred lights of Park Avenue. "Good. My fitting for the gown is tomorrow. I was thinking of a deep sapphire Oscar de la Renta." He finally turned to look at her, his expression one of pure, unadulterated boredom. "You won't be needing a gown, Isabella." The words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. "What do you mean, it's our table? We're patrons. I've been on the planning committee for 6 months." "Plans change," he said with a shrug. "I'll be attending with Scarlett. It's a business decision. Her new development is a major sponsor, and we need to present a united front for the press." Isabella felt the air leave her lungs. It wasn't just the affair anymore. That had been a deep, constant ache for the past year. This was different. This was a public execution. He was going to formally replace her at the most photographed, most talked about event of the season with her. "You can't be serious," she whispered, her voice trembling, despite her best efforts. "Richard, the humiliation." "What will people say? They'll say whatever I want them to say," he retorted, his voice hardening into the one he used to crush junior analysts. "They'll say I'm with a vibrant, powerful woman who is my equal. This is how the world works, Isabella. You should have learned that by now." He paused, letting the cruelty land. "Don't come to the ball. It would be embarrassing for everyone. Stay home. Go visit your mother in the Hamptons. Do whatever it is you do. Just don't be there." The car pulled up to their building, the doorman rushing to open the door. Isabella didn't move. She stared at her husband, the man she had loved, the man she had built a life with, and saw a stranger. The man who looked back at her saw nothing at all. He saw a piece of furniture. He was tired of an old stock he was ready to divest. "Understood?" he asked, his tone leaving no room for argument. She didn't answer. She simply got out of the car, walked through the marble lobby without looking at the concerned doorman, and rode the silent elevator up to the penthouse that had become her prison. That night, she didn't cry. Crying was a luxury afforded to women who still had hope. Isabella Sterling was fresh out of hope. But as she stood looking out over the glittering expanse of Central Park, a different feeling began to smolder in the pit of her stomach, an emotion she hadn't felt in a very long time: rage. Cold, clear, and clarifying. He had called her weak. He thought she was a decoration. He was about to find out how wrong he was. For 2 days, Isabella moved through her life like a ghost. She cancelled the dress fitting. She sent a polite, vague email to the gala committee, citing a personal family matter that required her to step back from her duties. She spoke to her staff in quiet, measured tones, her face a perfect mask of serene indifference. To the outside world, she was the dutiful wife, gracefully stepping aside. But inside her mind, a storm was raging. Richard, for his part, barely noticed her. He was energized, caught up in the thrill of his new public life with Scarlett. He left early, came home late, the scent of Scarlett's sharp, expensive perfume. Frederick Malle's portrait of a lady clinging to his suits. He treated Isabella with a detached courtesy that was more insulting than outright anger. He was a king who had already deposed his queen. Her continued presence in the castle was merely a logistical inconvenience he would soon resolve. On the 3rd day, Isabella made a phone call. Not to her mother or her society friends who would only offer platitudes and veiled gossip. She called Benjamin Carter. Benjamin was the senior partner at Carter, Llewellyn and Finch, a law firm so old and prestigious it made others look like pop-up shops. More importantly, he had been her father's lawyer and a close family friend. He had known Isabella since she was a little girl, with scraped knees and a fierce love for art history. He had also, with a heavy heart, negotiated her prenuptial agreement with Richard 15 years ago. They met not in his intimidating corner office overlooking the Statue of Liberty, but in a quiet, dusty room in the New York Public Library's Stephen A. Schwarzman building, surrounded by centuries of knowledge. It was Isabella's choice. She needed the weight of history around her, a reminder that empires rise and fall. Benjamin Carter was in his late 60s, with a shock of white hair and eyes that had seen every form of human greed and betrayal. He listened without interruption, as Isabella laid out the entire story, from the subtle dismissals and financial control to the final brutal command not to attend the gala. Her voice never broke. It was low, steady, and chillingly precise. When she finished, he took off his glasses and polished them slowly with a handkerchief. "The prenup is ironclad, Isabella. You know that. Richard's lawyers made sure of it. In the event of a divorce, you get the Hamptons house, a settlement of $10 million, and 5 years of alimony. In his world, that's severance pay." "I'm not interested in the severance pay, Ben," she said, her gaze unwavering. "I'm not interested in the Hamptons house, and I'm not planning to divorce him. Not yet." Ben leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "Then what are you planning?" "Revenge is a messy, expensive business. It rarely leaves the victor unscathed." "This isn't about revenge," Isabella corrected him, a hint of steel in her voice. "This is about a hostile takeover. He thinks of me as a subsidiary company he owns. He's stripping my assets and preparing for a merger with a new partner. I am simply going to enact a leveraged buyout of my own life." For the first time that morning, Ben smiled. It was a faint, watery thing, but it was there. "That's the Dubois fire," he murmured, referring to her maiden name. "Your grandfather was a brilliant, ruthless man. I see him in you right now." "My grandfather also left me something Richard has always dismissed as pocket money." Isabella continued, pulling a slim file from her Hermès handbag. "He left me the Dubois Trust. Richard's accountants manage it, of course. He sees it as my little art fund. He's never bothered to look at the fine print." Ben took the file. His eyes scanned the first page, then the second. They widened slightly. "Good heavens, Isabella, this isn't pocket money. The initial endowment was significant, but with compound growth over 25 years, and the specific investment clauses your grandfather stipulated, it's worth just shy of $95 million, Isabella finished for him. "And according to Clause 7, subsection B, upon my 40th birthday, which was 6 months ago, sole unrestricted control reverted to me. The managing accountants at Sterling Capital were legally obligated to inform me. They sent a letter. Richard saw it, laughed, and told me to have fun buying pretty paintings before tossing it on my desk. He never read it. He just assumed it was trivial. He assumed I was trivial. The plan began to form right there in the hallowed silence of the library. It was audacious, terrifying, and brilliant. For the next week, Isabella and Ben worked in secret. They used a discreet satellite office Ben kept for his most sensitive clients. They brought in a forensic accounting team that owed Ben a significant favor. The first step was to quietly, legally, and irrevocably move the entire Dubois Trust out from under the management of Sterling Capital's accountants. They transferred it to a private, fiercely independent bank in Switzerland. The transfer was structured in a way that it wouldn't raise any immediate red flags. It would look like a standard portfolio diversification. The second step was more complex. Isabella had spent 15 years observing Richard. She hadn't just been planning dinner parties. She'd been listening. She heard the names of companies he was targeting, the rivals he despised, the deals he considered his legacy. One name came up more than any other: Northgate Holdings, a struggling but innovative green energy firm. Richard saw it as his ticket to diversifying his portfolio and rebranding himself from a ruthless corporate raider to a forward-thinking visionary. He was in the final stages of a hostile takeover bid, slowly buying up shares to force the board's hand. He was confident, arrogant, and had told Scarlett over dinner. Isabella had overheard the call that the deal would be closed the week after the gala. It was to be his crowning achievement. "He's vulnerable there," Isabella told Ben, pointing to the Northgate file. His bid is aggressive, but he's stretched his capital thin to make it happen. He's counting on the good press from the gala to woo the last few wavering institutional investors. "What are you suggesting?" Ben asked, though he already saw the terrifying glint in her eye. "He wants to buy Northgate," Isabella said, a small, cold smile playing on her lips. "Then I'll buy it first." It was a staggering gamble. It would take almost every penny of her trust. But it wasn't just about the company. It was about the symbolism. He had tried to cast her out of his world, to bar her from the single most important night in his social and professional calendar. She wasn't just going to show up to his party. She was going to buy the dance hall, fire the band, and rewrite the guest list. The week leading up to the gala was a masterclass in deception. On the surface, Isabella was the picture of a woman in quiet retreat. She took calls from concerned friends, her voice tinged with a believable sadness. "Richard and I are just going through a difficult patch," she would murmur. "I just need some time. I'll be in the Hamptons." She did go to the Hamptons, for precisely one day. She had herself photographed by a friendly local paparazzo, a man she'd discreetly paid for years to capture flattering pictures of her at polo matches, walking mournfully on the beach, wrapped in a cashmere shawl. The photos syndicated to Page 6 and other society blogs painted the perfect picture: Isabella Sterling, the jilted wife heartbroken and hiding from the world. Richard saw the photos and felt a brief, satisfying pang of victory. It was all going according to plan. His wife was where she belonged, out of sight and out of mind. But while the world thought she was staring at the Atlantic Ocean, Isabella was in a sterile, anonymous office suite in Midtown, rented under a shell corporation created by Ben's firm. This was her war room. The walls were covered in whiteboards, filled with stock charts, corporate structures and lists of Northgate Holdings' major shareholders. With the Dubois Trust now liquid and sitting in a Swiss bank, Isabella, guided by Ben and a ruthless, hand-picked M&A specialist named Maria Flores, began her assault. They operated with the precision of a special forces unit. They couldn't start a public bidding war. Richard would notice immediately. Instead, they had to move like a ghost in the machine. Maria, a woman who spoke in clipped sentences and seemed to survive entirely on black coffee and market volatility, identified the key shareholders they needed to sway. They weren't the big banks or investment firms already in Richard's pocket. They were the silent partners, the quiet hedge funds, the retired founders who still held significant sentimental stakes. Isabella made the calls herself. She didn't introduce herself as Isabella Sterling. She used her maiden name, Isabella Dubois. The name still carried weight in certain old money circles. It spoke of stability, integrity, and a time before hostile takeovers were considered a sport. Her first call was to a man named Gerald Abernathy, the 80-year-old founder of Northgate, who had been reluctantly pushed into retirement, but still controlled 8% of the company's stock. Richard had tried to court him, and when that failed, had tried to bully him, an effort that had only hardened the old man's resolve. "Mr. Abernathy," Isabella said, her voice calm and respectful. "My name is Isabella Dubois. My grandfather was Arthur Dubois." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "I knew your grandfather," Abernathy said, his voice raspy. "A man of his word. They don't make them like that anymore. What can I do for you, Ms. Dubois?" Isabella didn't talk about profit margins or share prices. She talked about his legacy. She spoke of her own passion for renewable energy, a passion Richard had always mocked. She talked about preserving the company's innovative spirit, not gutting it for parts which she knew was Richard's true plan. She wasn't just offering to buy his shares. She was offering to become the guardian of his life's work. She offered him a price slightly above Richard's, but more importantly, she offered him a seat on the new board and a promise his vision would be honored. He agreed to sell her his entire stake. One by one, she and her team repeated this process. They approached a women-led venture capital fund in California that was hesitant to sell to a notorious predator like Richard Sterling. Isabella spoke to the partners not as a financier, but as a woman taking control of her own capital and destiny. They sold to her. They approached a university endowment fund, appealing to their charter for ethical investments. They sold too. Each transaction was conducted through a series of complex, layered shell companies, making the ultimate buyer impossible to trace in real time. To the market, it looked like a handful of disparate, minor investors were acquiring shares. Richard's team registered the activity, but dismissed it as market noise, small fish nibbling around the edges, while he, the great white shark, prepared for the final kill. His arrogance was Isabella's greatest shield. He simply couldn't conceive of a threat he didn't see coming. While the financial battle raged in secret, Isabella prepared for the public reveal. She didn't buy a new dress. She went into her vast temperature-controlled closet and pulled out a gown she had bought years ago but had never dared to wear. Richard had called it ostentatious. It was a custom-made Schiaparelli creation, a column of midnight black velvet that was deceptively simple from the front. The back, however, was a cascade of hand-embroidered silver and diamond shards that resembled a shattered mirror. It was a dress for a woman who was done being whole and perfect. She scheduled an appointment with the legendary hairstylist Garin, not for an elegant updo, but for a sharp, jaw-length bob that severed years of her old identity. She booked a makeup artist known for his work with powerhouse CEOs, instructing him to give her a look that was armored, not adorned. On the Friday of the gala, 5 hours before the doors of the Plaza Hotel would open, Maria Flores called. "It's done," she said, her voice betraying a rare hint of excitement. "The final block of shares just cleared. Combining our purchases with the shares already held by friendlies on the board, we have 51%. You are the majority shareholder of Northgate Holdings, Ms. Dubois. The company is yours." Isabella closed her eyes, a single deep breath steadying her. She looked at her reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back was not the timid, hesitant person from the restaurant a week ago. Her eyes were clear. Her jaw was set. She was not Isabella Sterling, the wife. She was Isabella Dubois, the architect of her own future. And she was about to make her grand entrance. The grand ballroom at the Plaza Hotel was a symphony of excess. Crystal chandeliers weighing thousands of pounds, each dripped light onto a sea of curated perfection. The air was thick with the scent of money, a heady mix of vintage champagne, hothouse flowers, and a dozen different perfumes, all vying for dominance. This was Richard Sterling's natural habitat. He stood near the grand staircase, a glass of Louis Roederer Cristal in his hand, feeling the familiar intoxicating buzz of being the center of gravity. Every eye was on him, and by extension on the woman clinging to his arm. Scarlett Roche was magnificent in her element. She wore a gold sequined Balmain gown that looked as though it had been poured onto her body, catching and fracturing the light with every movement. She laughed loudly, touched arms familiarly, and radiated a ferocious energy that demanded attention. Together they were a power couple for the modern age, ruthless, unapologetic, and dazzlingly successful. "Darling Marcus Thorne is here," Scarlett purred in his ear, gesturing with her chin towards a stern-looking man with a formidable silver mane. He controls the Vanguard Fund. If he's on board with the Northgate acquisition, everyone else falls in line. I've got at him, Richard said, his smile a predatory slash. He's old school. He just needs to see strength and a clear path to profit. And tonight, he squeezed Scarlett's hand. We are the picture of strength. He'd felt a small, nagging unease that morning. His chief analyst had reported some unusual trading activity around Northgate stock, a series of mid-level block purchases from untraceable offshore entities. He'd dismissed it. It's just arbitrageurs trying to skim a profit before the sale is announced, he'd said. Flies on the carcass. Ignore them. The idea that it could be a coordinated attack, a rival play, was laughable. No one had the capital, the nerve, or the intelligence to challenge him on his own turf. Least of all, he was certain, without even having to think about it, his wife. He thought of Isabella for a fleeting moment, picturing her on the beach in the Hamptons, a sad, lonely figure. The image gave him a sense of rightness, of order restored. She was a relic of his past, a woman suited for quiet country clubs and charity lunches. She didn't belong here in the arena where titans clashed. He was with Scarlett now, a woman who understood power, who craved it as much as he did. He and Scarlett moved through the room like sharks parting a school of fish. People clamored for a word, a nod, a moment of his attention. He was at the absolute zenith of his power, and the Northgate deal was the final jewel for his crown. He would announce it next week, and his legacy would be cemented. He finally cornered Marcus Thorne by the silent auction display, a collection of ludicrously expensive watches and vacation packages. Marcus, Richard said, clapping him on the shoulder. Good to see you. You know Scarlett Roach, of course. Thorne gave Scarlett a cool, appraising look before turning his full attention to Richard. Sterling, heard you're making a big move on the green energy sector. The future, Marcus, the future, Richard said expansively. Northgate is a diamond in the rough, a little polish, a little restructuring, and it's going to make our early investors very, very wealthy. The board's been resistant. Thorne noted his voice a low rumble. Abernathy still has a lot of loyalists. Sentimental old fools, Richard scoffed. They'll come around. I have the momentum. By the end of next week, it will be a done deal. I can guarantee it. As he spoke, he felt a subtle shift in the room's atmosphere. It was a change in pressure, a sudden dip in the ambient noise. Conversations near the grand entrance faltered. Heads began to turn. A wave of whispers started to ripple through the crowd, moving from the entrance inward. What's going on? Scarlett asked, annoyed at the distraction. Richard followed the gazes of the people around them. They were all looking at the top of the grand staircase. The master of ceremonies, a well-known television anchor, had moved to the podium, but he wasn't speaking yet. He was waiting. The orchestra had quieted. A woman had appeared at the top of the stairs. For a moment, Richard didn't recognize her. The figure was silhouetted against the gilded archway, poised and utterly still. She wore a column of black that seemed to absorb the light around her. Then she took a step forward, and the chandeliers caught the cascade of shattered silver down her back. Her hair was different, a sharp, dark bob that framed a face of pale, determined beauty. It was Isabella. A collective gasp went through the ballroom. It was a soft, sibilant sound, the sound of 1,000 people witnessing the impossible. This was not the heartbroken wife hiding in the Hamptons. This was not the quiet, demure Isabella Sterling they all knew. This woman was a stranger. She carried herself with an icy composure that was more intimidating than any overt display of anger. Her eyes swept the room, not with the look of a wounded animal, but with the cool, detached gaze of a monarch surveying her domain. Richard felt the blood drain from his face. It was as if he'd seen a ghost, a vengeful, exquisitely dressed ghost. Scarlett's grip on his arm tightened her perfectly manicured nails, digging into his sleeve. "What is she doing here?" she hissed, her voice a venomous whisper. "You told her not to come." Richard couldn't answer. His mind was reeling. This was a rebellion, a public act of defiance. He felt a surge of white-hot fury. How dare she? How dare she disobey him and show her face here to embarrass him, to create a scene? But as she descended the staircase, one deliberate step at a time, he realized this wasn't about creating a scene. Her eyes weren't searching for him. She wasn't looking for a confrontation. She seemed utterly terrifyingly indifferent to his existence. She was moving with purpose, and her destination was not him, but the center of the room where the gala's chairwoman, Patricia Lawford, was now standing waiting for her. The two women met, and Patricia, a woman who bowed to no one, took Isabella's hands in hers and smiled a smile of genuine, profound gratitude. The room was utterly silent. Richard Scarlett, Marcus Thorne. Everyone was frozen watching this surreal drama unfold. The king was on his throne, but a new unknown power had just entered the court, and no one, least of all Richard Sterling, knew the rules of her game. The master of ceremonies tapped the microphone, the sound echoing through the suddenly tomb-quiet ballroom. All eyes were fixed on the bottom of the staircase, where Isabella stood beside Patricia Lawford. "Ladies and gentlemen," the MC began, his voice resonating with practiced importance, "if I may have your attention for a special announcement." Richard stood paralyzed, a statue carved from rage and confusion. This had to be a nightmare. Isabella should be at home weeping. Instead, she was here, the focal point of the entire event. He could feel Marcus Thorne's questioning gaze on him, feel the weight of 100 other pairs of eyes. "As many of you know," the MC continued, "our foundation was facing a significant funding shortfall this year for our new pediatric wing. A month ago, we were on the verge of cancelling the project entirely. But then a miracle happened." Patricia Lawford stepped forward to the microphone, her face beaming. "It was more than a miracle," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "It was an act of profound and decisive generosity. An anonymous benefactor came forward, not just with a donation to cover the shortfall, but with an endowment large enough to fund the entire wing and its operations for the next decade." A wave of murmurs swept the room. 10 years. The amount had to be astronomical. Who had that kind of liquid capital and that level of philanthropic commitment? People scanned the crowd looking for the usual suspects, the tech billionaires, the oil tycoons. Richard's mind was racing. An anonymous benefactor. Was this part of her stunt? A desperate bid for attention. She was using her trust fund money, her pocket money, to buy her way back into the spotlight. The thought was pathetic. He would deal with her later, privately and ruthlessly. This donor wished to remain anonymous, Patricia said, her smile widening. But tonight, she has graciously allowed us to thank her in person. It is my profound honor to introduce the new patron of the Metropolitan Children's Foundation and the savior of the St. Jude Pediatric Wing. Richard braced himself. He expected to hear his own name, Mrs. Isabella Sterling. A grand gesture to win him back, perhaps. A public appeal to his better nature. The foolishness of it all made him sneer internally. But Patricia Lawford didn't say that name. She took a breath, her eyes shining as she looked at Isabella. "Please join me in thanking Ms. Isabella Dubois." The name hit the room with the force of a physical blow. Dubois, her maiden name. It was a public declaration of separation, a severing of her identity from his. For a split second, there was confused silence. People's minds struggled to connect the quiet, sidelined Mrs. Sterling with this powerful, commanding figure being introduced by her birth name. And then the second, more powerful shockwave hit. The whispers started tentative at first, then growing in volume as the pieces clicked into place. The heartbroken wife in the Hamptons. The photos. It had all been a diversion. While they were gossiping about her personal life, she had been making a move of unimaginable scale. Isabella stepped to the microphone. She did not look at Richard. Her gaze was directed at the assembled crowd, calm and authoritative. "Thank you, Patricia," she said, her voice clear and steady, amplified throughout the vast ballroom. It was a voice no one in that room had ever truly heard before. "My grandfather, Arthur Dubois, taught me that true wealth is not something you hoard, but something you deploy for the good of the community. For too long I have been a passive investor in my own life. Tonight, that changes." She kept her remarks brief, elegant, and devastatingly effective. She spoke of the Foundation's work, of the children who would be saved. She never mentioned her personal life, her husband, or the circumstances that had led her to this moment. She didn't have to. The context was screaming from every corner of the room. By refusing to acknowledge him, she erased him. She had become the center of the universe, and he was a distant, irrelevant planet. As she finished, the room erupted in thunderous applause. It was genuine, awestruck applause for her generosity, but it was also applause for the sheer breathtaking audacity of the drama they were witnessing. Socialites who had pitied her an hour ago were now looking at her with a mixture of fear and admiration. Isabella, with a small, polite nod, stepped back, allowing Patricia to reclaim the podium. She then turned not to survey her victory, but to walk toward a small, reserved table at the front of the room. Waiting for her there was her lawyer, Benjamin Carter, and a woman with a severe black bob and a shark-like intensity, Maria Flores. Her new board. It was only then, as she moved through the crowd which parted for her, as if she were royalty, that her eyes finally met Richard's. There was no hatred in her gaze. No anger, no pain. There was nothing. It was the indifferent glance one might give a piece of furniture or a stranger on the street. And in that single, empty glance, Richard Sterling understood. This wasn't about the gala. This wasn't about Scarlett. This wasn't even about their marriage. This was a coup. He had been so busy watching the front door, he never realized his enemy was already inside the citadel, rewriting the maps and changing all the locks. The ground beneath his feet, which had felt so solid just moments ago, had turned to quicksand. The gasps had been for her entrance, but the true shock was only just beginning to dawn on him. The applause died down, but the buzzing in the room only intensified. The story was spreading like wildfire, a torrent of whispers, texts, and sideways glances. Richard stood frozen, the half-empty glass of champagne feeling like a lead weight in his hand. Scarlett was still beside him, but the warmth and victorious energy had evaporated, replaced by a cold, calculating fear. "What was that?" she demanded, her voice low and tight. "Her maiden name, the Dubois Trust." "You told me that was nothing. It was nothing," Richard snarled, his mind struggling to catch up. He felt a primal urge to stride across the room, to grab Isabella's arm, to drag her out of the spotlight and remind her who was in charge. But he couldn't. He was paralyzed by the hundreds of eyes on him, all watching, all judging. Marcus Thorne, the investor. He'd been so confident about winning over, cleared his throat. "Sterling," he said, his voice stripped of all its earlier collegiality. "You guaranteed me the Northgate deal would be closed by next week. You said you had the momentum." "I do," Richard insisted, trying to project a confidence he no longer felt. A cold dread was starting to pool in his stomach. The timing of this, her sudden emergence as a major philanthropic power, it couldn't be a coincidence. "Are you certain?" Thorne pressed his eyes, narrowing. "Because a woman who can orchestrate a public spectacle of this magnitude right under her husband's nose is not a woman whose resources I would underestimate. You said your takeover was a sure thing. An attack like this on your personal front suggests a vulnerability I wasn't aware of. I'm going to have my team reassess our position." Without another word, Thorne turned and walked away, disappearing into the throng of guests who were now actively avoiding Richard's gaze. He was radioactive. In the space of 10 minutes he had gone from the king of the ball to a court leper. Scarlett saw it too. She saw the other power players subtly turning their backs, the wives who had once envied her, now looking at her with thinly veiled contempt. She had hitched her wagon to a man she believed was invincible. Now cracks were showing in his armor, and she had no intention of going down with the ship. "I need some air," she said, detaching her arm from his. There was no darling, no term of endearment. It was the cold statement of an associate cutting their losses. She slipped away, melting into the crowd, moving towards a rival billionaire she had been cultivating on the side. Left alone, Richard finally moved. He pushed through the crowd, his face a thunderous mask of fury. He didn't care about the scene anymore. He needed to confront her. He reached her table just as a waiter was pouring her a glass of water. Ben Carter and Maria Flores stood up as he approached, forming a protective barrier. "Move!" Richard commanded, his voice a low growl. Ben Carter looked at him calmly. "I don't think she has anything to say to you, Richard." "Isabella," he said, his voice rising, ignoring the lawyers. "What the hell do you think you're doing? You're making a fool of yourself, of me." Isabella looked up at him, her expression as serene as a frozen lake. "On the contrary, Richard," she said, her voice quiet, but carrying in the relative silence around their table. "I believe, for the first time in 15 years, I am doing something for myself. You told me not to come tonight. You were right. Mrs. Sterling shouldn't be here. So she isn't. Ms. Dubois, however, had a prior engagement." The sheer icy audacity of her words stunned him. He was losing control and he knew it. He leaned in closer, hissing, "This little stunt with your trust fund is pathetic. You think this changes anything? You are still my wife." Maria Flores chose that moment to speak, her voice sharp and precise. "Actually, Mr. Sterling, that is a point of contention. But what is not a point of contention is the current ownership of Northgate Holdings." Richard's blood ran cold. He stared at the unknown woman, then back at Isabella. "What are you talking about?" "As of 3:45 p.m. this afternoon." Maria continued, a predatory smile playing on her lips. A majority stake of 51% of Northgate Holdings was acquired by a privately held consortium, a consortium controlled entirely by Ms. Isabella Dubois. The world tilted on its axis. The buzzing in his ears became a deafening roar. Northgate, his deal, his legacy, the cornerstone of his future. She hadn't just embarrassed him. She hadn't just defied him. She had gutted him. She had taken a scalpel to the heart of his empire and carved out its most valuable prize. All those minor, insignificant stock trades. It had been her, moving in silence while he laughed at photos of her on the beach. He stared at her, truly seeing her for the first time. The quiet, indecisive woman was gone. In her place was a strategist, a killer. A woman who had learned his games by watching him for 15 years and had just beaten him at them. "How?" was all he could manage to whisper. Isabella took a slow, deliberate sip of water. "You taught me, Richard," she said softly. "You always told me to be decisive, to never let sentiment interfere with a good investment. You said weakness is a choice. I simply chose to be strong." He had no response. There was nothing to say. He had been publicly humiliated, financially outmaneuvered, and personally annihilated. He turned and stumbled away from the table, the whispers and stares of the crowd following him like a physical assault. He was no longer a king. He was a cautionary tale, a ghost at a feast that was no longer in his honor. His empire hadn't just been challenged, it had been conquered. And the new queen didn't even grant him a backward glance. The fallout from the Metropolitan Children's Foundation Gala was not a slow burn. It was an explosion. By the time the sun rose on Monday morning, the financial world was already ablaze with the story. It had been christened the Dubois coup by a witty blogger at Dealbreaker, and the name stuck echoing through the trading floors and boardrooms with a mixture of awe and schadenfreude. Richard Sterling was no longer just a headline. He was a punchline. He arrived at the offices of Sterling Capital before dawn, a hollowed-out man moving through the familiar halls on sheer desperate instinct. The silence of the vast office was unnerving. He stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office, the same view of Manhattan's skyline that had always made him feel like a god, and felt nothing but a gnawing emptiness. The city lights seemed to mock him, glittering like the shards of the shattered mirror on Isabella's gown. At 9:30 a.m., the opening bell of the New York Stock Exchange sounded not like an opportunity, but like a death knell. He watched the ticker for Sterling Capital ticker symbol STG appear on his screen. It opened down 15%. Within the hour, it was down 30%. The phones on the trading floor outside his office began to ring with a frantic, unending shrillness. His top analyst, a young, sharp-witted man named David Chen, whom Richard had personally mentored, entered the office without knocking. His face was pale. "Sir," he began, his voice strained. "It's a bloodbath. Marcus Thorne's fund liquidated their entire position at market open. It triggered a cascade. Everyone is running for the exits. The lenders for the Northgate bid are calling. They're invoking the material adverse change clause, citing reputational risk. They're pulling our credit line." Richard didn't turn from the window. "Sell the Westbrook portfolio," he said, his voice a dead monotone. "And the holdings in the Asian Tech Fund. Cover the margin calls." "Sir, that's our most profitable fund." "Just do it!" Richard roared, finally spinning around his face a mask of primal fury. David flinched, took a step back, and nodded before retreating from the room, leaving the king alone in his collapsing castle. He had spent a lifetime building an empire on the perception of invincibility. Now the world knew he had been outmaneuvered not by a rival hedge fund or a foreign power, but by the quiet, unassuming woman he had sent to the Hamptons to grieve. The humiliation was a deeper wound than the financial loss. His social death was just as swift and merciless. That week, he walked into the Grill, the Midtown Power lunch spot, where his presence had once commanded the best table, and felt a change so profound it was physical. The hum of conversation didn't just quiet, it shifted, turning into a low murmur of whispers that followed him as he was led, not to his usual booth, but to a small, isolated table near the kitchen. Men he had closed million-dollar deals with on a handshake now found the pattern of their bread plates intensely fascinating. No one met his eye. He ate alone, the taste of ashes in his mouth, and left without finishing his meal. His final encounter with Scarlett took place a week later. She summoned him to a cold, impersonal bar in the Mandarin Oriental. She was already there when he arrived, nursing a glass of mineral water. There was no pretense of affection. Her eyes were like chips of ice. "Richard," she began, foregoing any greeting, "I hear you're liquidating assets to shore up capital. Your commercial property on 52nd Street, the apex building. I'm prepared to make you an offer." She slid a piece of paper across the table. It was a number so far below market value, it was a direct insult. He stared at her, a wave of nauseating clarity washing over him. He had blown up his life for this woman, for what he thought was a partnership of equals of two hungry predators. He saw now that she had only ever seen him as a bigger shark to swim alongside, and now that he was wounded and bleeding, she was ready to join the feeding frenzy. "You have a lot of nerve." He breathed the words tasting like poison. She shrugged, unfazed. "It's just business, Richard. A lesson I learned from the best." She gave him a pointed look. "Don't be sentimental. It makes you look weak." He crumpled the paper in his fist and stood up, throwing a $100 bill on the table. He walked away without looking back, the echo of his own cruel words chasing him out into the cold city night. Meanwhile, across town, Isabella's new era was dawning in the quiet, elegant offices of Carter, Llewellyn and Finch. She sat opposite Ben Carter, signing the last of the divorce papers. Richard's lawyers had postured and threatened, but it was a hollow performance. With his finances in turmoil and his reputation in shreds, he had no appetite for a protracted public legal battle he was sure to lose. Isabella had asked for nothing from him. No alimony, no property, no settlement. She wanted only two things: a clean break and the legal right to the name she was born with. Her petition, citing irreconcilable differences in business philosophy, was granted without contest. She walked out of the law office not as Isabella Sterling, the former wife, but as Isabella Dubois, a free woman. Her leadership at Northgate Holdings was a revelation. She moved into the chairwoman's office and immediately had the heavy, dark mahogany furniture replaced with glass, steel, and light wood. She didn't rule from on high. She walked the floors talking to engineers and scientists, her questions sharp and insightful. She reinstated Gerald Abernathy to the board, not as a figurehead, but as a chief advisor, and his old guard wisdom combined with her fresh strategic vision proved to be a potent combination. In her first board meeting, she didn't present a plan for stripping assets and maximizing short-term profit as Richard would have. Instead, she unveiled a 5-year plan for investment in next-generation solar and battery technology, arguing that legacy was more valuable than quarterly returns. The board, accustomed to Richard's brand of corporate raiding, was stunned, then captivated. They voted for her plan unanimously. She found a new home, a penthouse apartment in Tribeca, with a terrace that overlooked the Hudson. It was modern, filled with light, and decorated not with the imposing museum-quality art Richard had collected as investments, but with the vibrant, challenging works of emerging artists she truly loved. She established the Dubois Foundation, which quickly became a major force in the city's cultural life, endowing an arts education program for public schools. She was building a world that reflected her own values, a world of growth, beauty, and quiet strength. One crisp autumn afternoon, almost a year after the gala, her car was stopped in traffic on Park Avenue. She glanced out the window and saw him. Richard was walking out of his office building looking diminished. His shoulders were stooped, his expensive suit seemed to hang off his frame, and the confident stride of the master of the universe had been replaced by the weary shuffle of a man burdened by defeat. He looked up, and for a long, silent moment, their eyes met across the chaotic stream of yellow taxis and black cars. She saw in his face a flicker of confusion, of anger, of something that might have been regret. In that moment, Isabella felt no surge of triumph, no lingering bitterness. The rage that had fueled her had long since cooled, leaving behind not a scar, but clean, solid ground on which to build. He was simply a man from another lifetime, a ghost from a story that had already ended. She gave him a single small final nod, a gesture not of forgiveness or pity but of closure, an acknowledgement of a past that was well and truly past. Then the traffic moved, her driver accelerated, and she turned her head facing forward, watching as the city skyline unfolded ahead of her. The car carried her downtown away from the life that had been, and towards the one she was creating a future bathed in the bright, clear light of her own making. And there you have it. The story of Isabella Dubois is a powerful reminder that the people others underestimate are often the ones with the most strength held in reserve. Her journey wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclamation. She reclaimed her name, her power, her identity, and her future. Richard Sterling didn't lose his empire because of a bad business deal. He lost it because he fundamentally failed to see the value, intelligence, and fire in the woman standing right next to him. What did you think of Isabella's incredible transformation? Have you ever witnessed someone turn the tables so completely on a person who wronged them? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. If you were captivated by Isabella's story of strength and justice, please show your support by hitting that like button. It truly helps our channel grow. And if you want more stories of dramatic twists and powerful comebacks, make sure you subscribe and ring that notification bell so you never miss an upload. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder of their own inner power. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you in the next story.